Hi folks, this is Lenny Esposito with Come Let Us Reason Together, bringing you another Come Let Us Reason podcast. Right now, I'm traveling, speaking at a apologetics conference at New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary. But I'm bringing you another of our discussions that I've had with the apologetics.com team on Carl Trueman's book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. Today, we look at probably one of the more influential figures whose ideas form the seeds of what we see in our emotive modern society. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was someone who had a vast influence on many people, from the concept of the noble savage to the idea that man is born basically good and can, if left to himself without the constraints of society, flourish in his own way. These concepts are fundamental to the way Rousseau saw the world, and really they are some of the things that people have picked up in their modern understanding of identifying with their inner selves. So it's an interesting discussion. It's something I think that you'll grow from, and I hope that you'll enjoy it. So stay tuned for this next episode of Come Let Us Reason Together.
Well, welcome to the apologetics.com radio show, where we challenge believers to think and thinkers to believe. I'm Harry Edwards, your host for the evening, and joining me in the studio are my good buddies, Lenny Esposito and Dr. Jacob Daniel. How are you doing, gentlemen?
Good morning.
Good.
Great.
All right. Well, we're going to be continuing in our discussion of Carl Trueman's book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. And if you've been following this series and haven't gotten the book, I would strongly encourage you to get the book. I think it's a must read. And if you're interested in understanding the times, especially if you care to understand the times we live in. Do you guys have that book in your hand? Maybe you can point it right there on that camera. There you go. Highly recommend it, and I think you will find it very helpful as you follow along. And our goal is to synthesize, kind of summarize the chapters, his ideas, and make it maybe interesting to our times, make it relevant to our times. I know the book was written a couple years ago, I think.
But we're still in the, it addresses how did we get to the crazed movement, and that's where we're still at.
We're still here. So it's
2 years ago.
2 years ago, I was right. So it's still very, very relevant. And if you want the layperson's view version, because I understand not all are well-versed in philosophy, then you might want to pick up the title also written by him, Strange New World, How Thinkers and Activists Redefine Identity and Spark the Sexual Revolution. Have you seen a copy of that, gentlemen?
I've not gotten the copy yet. I'd be interested to.
Yeah, I'd be interested to see and compare, right?
Yeah.
But I have friends who are reading it currently.
Okay.
Yeah,
that's good.
Yeah, it's a distillation of this book. It's not, so it takes it and simplifies it, so to speak.
There you go.
Is what its
and
goal is.
there is some addition to that as well, some new ideas.
Yeah, I believe
that are relevant to the churches. Yeah,
which means that there will probably be a second edition of this book coming out at some point in time when he adds to it. So, which would be interesting.
Yeah, that's good. I am reminded of this verse in Scripture, 1 Chronicles 12:32. It's often quoted nowadays. It reads, "Of Issachar, men who had understanding of the times, to know what Israel ought to do." And then a few verses down there says, "Men of war arrayed in battle order." I believe we are currently in a battle, gentlemen. I know I used to avoid saying culture war, but it's unavoidable now. I'm sorry. I think we are in a culture war. And I think it's important to know that we are, because if we think we aren't, then we let our guard down, right? Or we have no defenses. We're just going to let the enemy trample all over us without any fight. And before you know it, we are living in a different world, and that's not good. And God has commanded us to be good stewards of his kingdom to begin with. We are caretakers. I don't know if maybe our listeners or we've thought about the whole context behind that verse. The men of Issachar were part of David's mighty men. And if you know anything about David's mighty men, it's like just in the movies, they were responsible for defeating armies many times their size. And they fought valiantly, and they were with David, and they were very successful. And so it's interesting that the men of Issachar are part of that army.
Yeah, they're the special forces, if you were. And in any special forces, you'll have experts in various skills.
Right.
So you have the paratroopers, the frogmen, right? The Navy SEALs, the Green Berets. All of those individuals are trained in different aspects of warfare in order to infiltrate the enemy or conquer a specific instances. And what you're saying is the men of Issachar, they were the intelligence operatives, if you will. Yeah. They were the guys who had their finger on the pulse of what the culture believed, of what they were doing, and they could then answer and counter any false ideas or corrupting influences that would have weakened the nation.
Yeah.
And they were not part of it because they got some participation medals.
Right. Yes. Oh, don't get me started.
You're going to bring that up later. You have to bring that up later. Yeah. Well, before we get into our topic, any ministry updates? I know, Jacob, you said you have a plug you want to mention?
Yeah, but before I do that, it's been a joy over the past 2 weeks to actually lead a series of teachings on apologetics and issues relevant to our culture, like personhood, human dignity, role of government, Christian responsibility towards the governments that God has established. So on Sunday, it's the last day of the series. I'm really excited about that and spend some time with the audience. Good response. So I'm grateful for that. So I'm really looking forward to a conference coming up in November, organized by the Branch of Hope Church here in Torrance. It's Banson Conference, and the registration is open. We got an amazing lineup of speakers. Yeah. People like David Banson, who is the son of Greg Banson. We have Jeffrey Ventrella. We have Douglas Wilson, Jeff Durbin, and a few other speakers. So if anyone is interested, Nice Wonger,
and
yes,
you.
I'll be one of the speakers as well, and Jason Gallagher.
Jason, yeah. It's like the apologetics.com team, right?
Yeah, it's an amazing team. It's a great opportunity for anyone here in SoCal.
Yeah.
If you have an opportunity, I would say go to the website bansonconference.com and you can register there. And don't miss this opportunity. It'll be very much a practical approach to engaging with our culture. So.
Very good. Very good. How about you, Lenny?
Well, I'm excited. I'm off to Omaha, Nebraska in just a couple of weeks. We'll be speaking at Creation Days Festival for Standing Stone Bible Church in Gretna, which is a suburb of Omaha. So that's 3 nights, Sunday night, Monday night, Tuesday night. I guess they have a kind of a fair and things that kick off the whole event on Saturday. It should be a really good time. We're going to be talking about issues of science, creation, evolution, and how we as Christians in the 21st century are able to understand, unpack that, and where the balance the truth with the scientific enterprise will be. So that's coming up just this next month. And then the other thing that I've been doing on the ministry side is we've been doing a pretty good push on Instagram, having an Instagram campaign where we're putting these little video snippets up and engaging with secularists, seekers, and atheists even online. So that's been a lot of fun too.
Good. That's good. Well, before we get into our topic tonight, I'd like to remind our listeners that we are supported entirely by your generous donations. So if you find our shows to be valuable and wish for it to continue, please support us by liking and sharing this on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and other social media outlets. You can also help us with our radio costs by going to our website, www.apologetics.com, and click on the donate button. Any amount helps, and your partnership will help us remain on the air. Again, I want to continue to plug our certificate program, fully online. I believe that it's valuable, and it has a cultural apologetics theme to it. And many of the speakers there are from our batch of staff members at apologetics.com. So, all right, gentlemen, let's get into our topic for this evening. We are on chapter 3, and the title, he made it clever because it's the other Genevan. Because when we talk about the Genevan, who are we talking about typically?
Usually it's Calvin.
Calvin, that's right, our favorite Genevan. But there is another Genevan who has made waves in the philosophy world, and his name is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So he's a big name philosopher.
Yeah.
And if you want to...
Although he hated philosophy.
and I think he really wasn't properly trained as one, right?
No, he never went to actually any school. He was a polymath, innovator, musician, philosopher, political, theorist.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Coming out of that time, I think it was just, hey, if you can write long essays and say whatever, yeah. If it sort of made sense, yeah.
While he was all this, he was not known to be a good father or person who you can engage with socially. He even known to have sent his children to adoption centers.
Yeah.
So he has a very sketchy kind of like
that's
background.
True. Well, even if it's in his writings, right? Visiting prostitutes, and to him that was actually one of a transformational thing for him. We'll see if we get into that. But so this topic is on Rousseau's thinking and how we got to the psychological man, as Reef would put it, kind of like the last part of the various descriptions of human culture. We're at the end. And I think we're still in this. We're still in the middle of this psychological man stage.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm just going to ask you guys, what are some of the things that hit you here, that gave you an impression of or insight, with matching that with what's going on in culture?
Well, one of the things that you notice right away is the idea of individualism changes from personal responsibility to personal happiness, personal motivation based on what you feel. And that's, I think, one of the major shifts that Rousseau is responsible for. Prior to Rousseau, the individual, if you go way back, and we've talked about this in the past, the Romans and the Greeks and even non-Christian societies like Islam, the Japanese Buddhist societies, they didn't see an individual as the primary component of society. See, they were substructures underneath the society, but the society was primary. So you're either a Roman or you're a barbarian. That kind of a dichotomy. You're either a Jew or a Gentile. You're either part of the in-group or you're not. Mm-hmm. But the group itself is the primary. Mm-hmm. Paul, and then Augustine, understanding Paul, really starts to say, well, there's an individual responsibility that one has, and our sins are individualized and our forgiveness is individualized. And you can't just be a Christian or a non-Christian in the sense of you're part of the group. You have to have a personal one-on-one understanding of your sin, and you have to have a personal one-on-one reconciliation with your God. So that was a huge shift. A great book on this is called Inventing the Individual by Larry Seidentop. And it talks about how Christianity is actually the fundamental shift of this concept of the individual becoming central as opposed to society or the broader culture or the polis being central.
The Reformation also affirmed that.
The Reformation develops that and affirms that more. But out of the Reformation, what Rousseau does is he takes it sideways.
Yeah.
And he doesn't seem to like Augustine's understanding. He likes the idea that Augustine says we're all individuals, but he doesn't like the understanding that Augustine centers the individual on the fact that the individual is an individual sinner. And so Rousseau says it's not that I'm a sinner, it's that I have individual feelings. And his whole project is to say the feelings are what are the honest piece about me. It's my feelings that count, and then what happens,
self, right? That's
right.
The natural
self. So his state of nature
Yeah.
is the phrase that you hear in political philosophy all the time. That if there's this idyllic, and this doesn't exist in the real world, this is a hypothetical construct,
right?
That
he made up, actually.
Yeah,
right?
that he actually crafted. That if you could place a person in an environment where they can just seek to meet their needs of food, of shelter, of basic safety, basic wants, then they would never be evil. They would have their basic needs met, and they would be happy, and they would be free to express themselves individually. It's very much a modern humanist understanding as well. Matter of fact, Gene Roddenberry pictures the Star Trek universe in this way. We don't work for money. We work just for the satisfaction of exploration, because we've got these replicators and these things. Our technology has brought us to the point of where we don't need those kinds of things anymore. Now, of course, that's nonsense, because if you've ever watched any of the Star Trek movies, you know there's always conflict, and there's always people doing things that are selfish for themselves. So, and they have to have, a military order and things like that. So even Roddenberry contradicts himself. And this is the problem with Rousseau as well. But Rousseau feels that the central person is, number one, he assumes that people are intrinsically good,
Right.
and that they're corrupted by the external pressures of the world put around them, that they're just all these different layers that people bestow upon you. You have to be a good part of society, so therefore you cannot do this. Maybe you can't, sleep around because our morals tell you not to do that. Therefore, that causes frustration for you, and that frustration, then you act out. Or it says you have to get ahead in the world. So therefore you start to lie and cheat and steal at work, because the push is for you to succeed in life. So Rousseau says it's all these external stimuli that are actually corrupting us, but inherently we're good. And really, that's what we see today.
Yeah.
We see that in spades, that people are taking this concept and running with it.
Right.
Yeah, I think Truman puts it this way: the difference between Augustine and Rousseau is one of, for Augustine, the inward-looking aspect was primarily as a prelude to outward-looking. In terms of you're finding meaning not from within, from outside, whereas that's not the case with Rousseau. And it's reading this makes sense in terms of where we are as a culture. If we see the whole idea of systemic racism and the emphasis on that it's not the individual responsibility, but because you belong in a system, it's the system that corrupts you. And it's so much reflective of the fact that how does this idea that Rousseau is, discussing in his writings and in his work is kind of like trickling down through the culture and the way we see things working out today.
Well, like I mentioned on our trip here, that if I can summarize Rousseau in a simple way, it seems like all of the negative aspects of humanity could always be blamed, not you. It's always out there. The blame is always out there. Corrupting nature of society. So,
in one sense, there is a distinction that can be seen in today's realities, is that there's this idea of progressivism, right? Looking forward to becoming better.
Right.
Whereas in terms of Rousseau, it's looking back to getting back to our primal state of having those basic needs being met. So we are, in one sense, living in a utopian society where everything is shared equally.
Yeah.
And there is no competition. There is no
if
aggression
we were
towards your
only
neighbor.
free to be ourselves in however we feel, without any competition, without any external pressures, then we would never need to be evil, because we wouldn't even think about going there, because all of our desires would be met.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Tony Campolo
Yeah.
used to, in his talks, talk about a gentleman that he'd counseled, and the guy said, that's the problem. Society keeps laying all of these burdens on me and all these layers on me, and I just want to peel them back and find out who I really am. I want to get back down to the real me. And Capallo asks him, well, what if you're an onion? What do you mean? Well, once you peel back all the layers, what happens if there's nothing left? Have you ever considered that option? And this is where I think Rousseau goes wrong. How does he know that we're basically good? Where does he get that information from? Where is he making that assumption? Because if you start with the wrong assumption, you can have a lot of right proposals, right? You can have a lot of right propositions, but if one of them is wrong, that's a necessary component to your argument, then your argument's going to fail.
Right.
And this is not to disregard that there is some societal responsibilities as
absolutely.
well, and we do actually give into certain pressures that we are put under. At the same time, we should be asking, what is society basically?
Right.
It's a collective of the individuals,
right.
and therefore the responsibilities at the end does come to the individuals.
So biblically, let's take a biblical position on this. Let's take the state of nature biblically. When do we see the state of nature biblically? Adam and Eve, Garden of Eden, prior to the fall. They encounter an external pressure, right? Satan comes in, tempts her with the apple. Oh, you shall not surely die. So there's the external pressure. But the Bible also says that she saw that the fruit looked good, that it was desirable to make one wise. And so there's a personal aspect of it, a personal weakness that she alone is responsible for, and then Adam also following the instruction of his wife. So both are true. Yeah. And when
I was going to say though, where's the society in that story?
The devil is the society.
The external side.
That's the external.
Sure.
That's the external force. But when you capitulate to the external force, ultimately the blame falls on you. So you can't say, these poor guys who are shooting at one another in the inner cities of Chicago and their stray bullets happen to catch a second grader. You can't say, well, they didn't know any better because that's how they were raised and that's how the inner city is. And you can't, you can't judge them because their lived experience is not your lived experience. No, we're human beings, and you can, even if no one told you, hey, don't shoot randomly into a house. We all have enough of a brain to say, yeah, that may actually go bad for me. If you stop and think, but they don't want to stop and think, they just want to react on their feelings. Right. But our society, there are many of the critical race folks who would say it's not their fault that they're killing each other.
Right. It's definitely not their fault. And that's how society's portrayed right now. Right?
And I think, Lenny, you pointed out a while ago how even when God approaches Adam, he then, puts responsibility on Eve.
That's right. Yeah, Adam blames her. Or it's her. It wasn't me. Yeah. And God said, yeah, I'm not even going to take that.
So there's a proto-Rousseau, right?
That's right.
Proto-Rousseau right there.
So what Rousseau is doing, I think he knows deep down, I think he has some guilt. I mean, he's living in a 16th century culture, a 17th century culture.
18th century culture.
Was he early
18th century. So it's like 1700.
1700, sorry. Yeah. And he knows that the things going to visit prostitutes, abandoning your children. I mean, he knows. That those things are wrong.
Yeah.
Funny, he doesn't show pity on his kids. We'll get to that.
Right. We'll get to that. But he did on the prostitute to some degree.
To some degree.
Yeah.
But then he's trying to justify it.
Yeah.
That's exactly what he's doing. He's trying to get out of it by blaming out there.
Yeah. And that story with Virat, and by the way, this is apparently part of his Rousseau's formation, the stealing of the asparagus.
Yes.
Apparently, a man persuaded him to steal for him so he could sell it, so he could have money. And Rousseau's justification for that is, he didn't steal it for greed, because sometimes we think that we
he
steal
stole
for
the
greed.
asparagus to give it to the other guy.
To the other guy.
He didn't benefit
so
himself
he's
per
saying
se.
that there's really nothing wrong with it. What makes it wrong is now maybe the guilt placed by society or the peer pressure. Really.
Well, he said he wouldn't steal at all if the guy hadn't come up to him, and the thought wouldn't have even crossed his
right.
mind had the guy not quote unquote pressured him.
So
into
that's blame number one to Mr. Virat right there, and then blame number two. He had this other experience with a prostitute, and this one I told you guys I need to read the exact source, because according to Truman, Rousseau was struck by Zulieta's beauty, and he was speechless, and yet at some point noticed some defect on her. And it's interesting because maybe something that was so perfect gets marred all of a sudden in at least Rousseau's mind. He goes to the other extreme, and now this prostitute is now a monster.
Yeah.
And then what does he do? He blames it on the corrupting nature of society. So it's interesting. Again, blame number two, right? And then the other experience that he had was this essay that he wrote, Discourse on Sciences and the Arts. And it seems like he just saw the announcement on the paper and started just writing. This is something that he did, which formalized and crystallized his ideas.
It was a contest.
It was a contest, yeah.
And the Science Academy folks thought that people would be writing about how science and the arts have made life better.
Right.
Yeah.
And he did the opposite,
Yeah.
which is very Rousseau, right? And so that he
Contrarian.
got notoriety because of that. What do you guys think of that? Do you guys think that really that's part of his foundation for thinking that everything is just to blame, not him, but just everybody else?
The question comes down to, like, he's also appealing to a standard, and the standard is his own self. Now, as a human being, how is that being justified is the question, right? He's not appealing to a transcendent law or anything. And I think there is a temptation here, which we also find in our generation as well, is that we have issues submitting to God's law. That's where the issue is. So what we do is actually we break his law so that we show ourselves above the law. And who remains above the law? It's always God who remains above the. So it's an attempt to replace God and enthrone oneself. And I think in Rousseau's case, that's exactly what's happening. He's putting himself in the place of making himself the standard.
Yeah, because if it's not God, really, it becomes we that become God.
And then anything goes.
And then anything goes. Well, I hear the music, gentlemen, which means it's our signal to go to a break. We have been discussing Chapter 3 of Carl Trueman's book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. We'll be right back after a few messages. Welcome back to the second half hour of the Apologetics.com radio show. Good evening. I am Harry Edwards, your host for the evening. And we have been talking about Carl Trueman's book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. We're on Chapter 3. The title of that chapter is The Other Genevan, and that other Genevan is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So we've been, the last half hour, we just talked a lot about his ideas and what led him to develop those ideas. And basically, a good summary of that is he ends up just blaming society for all of society's ills, including, I guess, our personal corruption of ourselves. So one of the things that's big on his thinking is the idea of pity. In fact, it is, according to Trueman, the basis for his ethical framework. What do you think that is, Lenny? What's that all about?
Well, when Rousseau talks about pity, it's not, "Oh, poor baby." That's the modern connotation, but it's a broader understanding of seeing another and kind of reflecting as I may be in that situation. How would I feel if I were in that situation? So again, Rousseau is all about self self-preservation, meeting my needs, meeting my desires. And if my situation were that I were hurt or that I were in a area where I needed help from someone else, then pity kicks in. And what Rousseau says is he sees this as natural and fundamental to the human condition, that it's, you don't think about it. So something like mathematics isn't necessarily fundamental to the human condition to say, oh, if I need to get, I know I want to get here in 20 minutes. I know that it's 20 miles away. I could do a quick calculation, means I got to drive a mile a minute, got to drive 60 miles an hour to get there. So that's a conscious decision. Right. Or pity is unconscious. You see someone, you immediately want to react. So therefore, Rousseau says, well, pity is one of these things that's inherent in our souls. Therefore, this is one of the ways that we are basically good. And if we were not corrupted by society, then our pity would drive us to continue to be basically good. That's his argument.
I want to add to that too, and you can continue, but it's interesting that pity, again, part of the whole self-preservation, part of the loves that he talks about, the self-preservation, it's uncomfortable to have that pity, that feeling.
Yeah.
So then he must, or we must act to resolve that pity.
That's true.
So in other words, he also actually believes in this, I think it's a Confucian construction of the golden rule: don't do unto others which you wouldn't want done to you.
Right.
So
he says the basis of that is kind of a pity
that's right.
driver. So that's where he comes into this.
So it's not very altruistic. It's actually taking care of the situation because it's uncomfortable to me.
Yeah.
Uncomfortable to us.
And is it where he actually distinguishes between sympathy and empathy? Where basically the idea that you enter into someone else's shoe to experience what they are going through by recognizing what they're going through, not just standing outside and sympathizing with them and not getting involved.
Yeah, in some aspects that's true. And again, Rousseau is saying he's using this as an example because, again, we challenge the idea that people are fundamentally good. Anybody who has a 2-year-old or has ever had a 2-year-old knows that you don't have to teach them to be selfish. You have to teach them to be kind. You have to teach. So that it's a suspect assumption on its face. Mm-hmm. But one of the things he's saying is, well, pity is inherent. It's happens immediately without us thinking about it. That may be true, but then again, we're swimming in the milieu of the Christian worldview, right? And so part of what we catch is this idea that, number one, other people are equal, mm-hmm. and that we therefore have a duty to our fellow man. And in Christianity, they would say more than ourselves, right? Don't walk 1 mile, walk 2. These are all teachings that Jesus had. And that was different than most other cultures. But I can show you even in other instances where immediate reactions aren't necessarily inherent or inert into the individual. They're culturally based. And modesty would be one of those. So there are many different cultures that have many different views on modesty. Now, the idea of modesty has some play, but there are certain Aboriginal tribes and African nations where it's nothing more than a fig leaf, and their feelings of discomfort don't exist at all. Whereas if you go to certain Islamic countries, if their hair is uncovered, they immediately react. They don't think about it. It feels inherent to them to cover themselves because their hair is uncovered and a man's coming in the room or something to that effect. So here's an example of where culture actually does elicit a response that's immediate, automatic, and because you've grown up in it your whole life, it's the only thing that you've known, and you feel it's as natural as anything else. Mm-hmm. So I don't buy the fact that Rousseau's pity is something intrinsic in us, other than the fact that God has written upon our heart his law. That can still be twisted. That can still be corrupted. It's there, but again, we don't know. The final outcome of what we feel is that a distorted view, or is that the right view? Because we need an external referent against which to compare it to tell whether it's distorted or not.
And I think the fact that we all have the image of God on us, though it's maybe marred by sin, but there is this tendency of recognizing that image on the other and a response to that. I think that's ingrained within us.
Yeah. With the whole idea of pity as Rousseau would understand it, right? Do you guys think that the idea today of kindness or niceness might be a little tinged by this thinking by Rousseau? Because it's more like, I'm nice because I want you to be nice to me.
Well, it's you cannot criticize.
That's right. You cannot.
You cannot. The other person has his feelings, and they're just as valid as your feelings, and therefore, any criticisms you have is being critical against the very core being of who that individual is.
That's why we see that even in the scripture, that distinction is maintained. That when we see Christ, he sympathizes with us. Not empathizes with us in our sin, in that he becomes a sinner by doing sin. No, he just sympathizes with us, that he takes on sin on himself to redeem us. And that has to be maintained. In our culture, we don't do that unless and until I agree with you with whatever, preferences you may have, that I have to really acknowledge it and celebrate that with you.
Yeah.
I have to empathize with you.
Right.
I can't simply step back and say that, no, that's not the right thing to do. Though I sympathize with you because I'm also one of the sinners.
Right.
Chief among them.
Yeah. Nowadays, the demand is that you enter into that other person's view of reality, whether it's right, wrong, or indifferent, and you can't say and that's
the difference.
Radical shift.
That's right. The shift there is in Christianity. There is that altruism. You do it selflessly, but in this Rousseauan idea, there's a quid pro quo type arrangement.
And even you take the story of the adulterous woman. Jesus doesn't condemn her, but he also says, "Go and sin no more." So there's still a standard in which he's trying to uphold. Today, they're asking us to tell the anorexics that they're fat. Yes, I agree with you. You need to lose 5 more pounds. That because the transgender kid, 13, 14, yes, let's get your breasts removed. Let's put you on puberty blockers. No, that's not what you're supposed to do.
Yeah. What else is danger? So we acknowledge that there are some factors that's in society that do affect us and transform us and form us. But what are other dangerous things that Rousseau kind of imports into our culture today?
I think Truman touches on that, and he acknowledges one of the symptoms in our culture also, the need to actually recognize and acknowledge all voices, including young people who have not lived their life enough to experience many things in their life, to come to a conclusion and to a decision in their life. Whereas we actually, without questioning, say yes to their demands, right? Because they are closer to the primal state. We think they are not violated enough by the society.
Yeah, they haven't had enough years.
They're not corrupted enough.
Yeah. So instead of, and this can happen within the church as well, where what we are doing is actually we are losing authority of the elders completely, and we're listening to the sheeps in leading the church.
Well, and even listening to secular society, right?
Yeah.
Why is the modern rock concert the model for the modern worship service? Why did we pick up on that? When did it stop being congregational and start being performative? Fog machines, lighting systems.
Lasers.
And if you see a lot of Christian institutions, educational institutions, this has been the symptom over the past decades, where the decisions were not coming from the administration or from the president's office, but the presidents and people in leadership are motivated to make changes and bring them about because of the demands of the students.
Yeah, that's right.
There's no
not even the parents. It's
not even the
students.
Yeah, there's no bravery in modern academia anymore.
And today in the school, if a child comes and says that if a boy comes and says, I feel like a girl, the teachers don't have to actually consult with the parents or anyone else, but they actually enforce that even more, acknowledge that even more, and allow for those changes to take place. at that young
Yeah, they
age.
actually even rush them through it. There's more and more stories coming in where they're literally not even when the kid is starting to say, "Well, I'm not quite sure anymore." Oh, no, let's keep going. I mean, they're actually feeding the dysphoria. It's bad.
And the other example is that, Harry, you mentioned about, especially we see this, the extreme side of that in the European nation, where we don't see criminal acts as being criminal anymore as we used to. It's not punitive. It's not,
right, because it's not their fault.
Not their fault. So we provide
fault,
them with luxurious accommodations to live in,
because
on
they have to
taxpayers'
discover
money.
themselves. That's right.
So there is no punishment for the crime that they have done. We need to actually help them get reformed through programs and give them benefits and make their life as comfortable as possible, because they're corrupted by the society, not by their own will.
Right. You mentioned kind of like the move toward having the young people be the authority, because perhaps they have wisdom since they come from a less depraved state, according to Rousseau. So I still remember a time when you had Britney Spears, Justin Bieber, all in their teens, being the standard of music. I remember Greta Thunberg. Yeah. My goodness, what was she like?
16.
Time Person of the Year or something?
Yeah, at 16, because 16. she stood up in front of people who've been studying climate for 50 years and all these academics, and made demands that were very broad, that were very vague, thinking that somehow you can wave a magic wand and change things. And she just emoted. Basically, she just emoted. Right. And everybody said, "Oh, that's great."
Right. It's another interesting thing about Rousseau. We've been talking about him. He predates a lot of the philosophers who we think are really saying what he's saying, like Freud and Hegel. But yet, I'm glad that Truman goes all the way back to Rousseau, and we will be talking about how Marx borrows from Rousseau at some point. When it comes to education and, let's say, parenting, how would Rousseauan philosophy affect the field of education, let's say?
Well, I think you're seeing some of it in the idea of not so much education, although it's being reflected there as well, but even in corporate America, where Target is trying to get rid of girls' aisles and boys' aisles and have these genderless, right? Let the kids explore as to what they want to do. Of course, part of the problem with this is that you find out that kids actually do fall into natural camps of male and female, no matter what you try to do. Toy companies would have loved to have done this for the last 50 years, because you double your audience, right? If you make a Barbie that both boys and girls can buy, that's 100% increase over your previous sales figures. But it's not been effective. Just like you take away the toy guns out of the stores, and you find kids are taking Pop-Tarts and, biting them into the shape of a gun. And then they're still getting expelled from school for that kind of thing.
Right.
So it's staggering. So the idea that you can be your real self, but maybe not so much, if it bucks the current standards of the day. But we see it in education in what they call social emotional learning. The SEL is a big push right now, which is really based on a lot of critical theory. But social and emotional learning is having children find their own way in their own time to explore their own path, so that they can come and learn what's best for them. Here's one. California there's legislation in the state of California. It's not been signed yet, but it probably will be, that it will be illegal to start high school before 8:30 a.m. Because what they've found is that high school and junior high kids who are sleep deprived do worse in school. Now, why are they sleep deprived? Because they have to get up at 7:30 in the morning, or they have to get up and get to school at 7:30 in the morning. That's not actually why they're sleep deprived. They're sleep deprived because they're playing video games all night.
And chatting with their friends. Right.
So instead of saying, kids, go to bed at 10, I'm going to take your phone away from you, we're going to turn off the internet.
Yeah.
which is what past cultures would have done.
Right.
We're literally changing the law in the state to force schools to start later for the sake of the children.
Right.
And that's happening right now.
And the other thing is that by putting all our kids at that very natural state of just achieving that basic need for life, we are suppressing their creativity. We are separating their the character that needs to be formed, even through competition, even through engagement with each other and socializing with each other. By putting them all at the same level and recognizing their infant nature as being primal and necessary and good, I think we are not developing virtue, which used to be the task of education.
Right.
Even the responsibility that parents have is one of inculcating in them that virtuousness, right?
Yeah.
Being citizens of good character that would contribute to the flourishing of the society. And that has to happen in a collective existence, not just by isolating them to the point that we only recognize what they want to be for themselves.
Well, it's interesting. Any skill of value is a skill that's been honed within a restricted scenario. So if you're a writer, and there are a lot of people who can simply write. If you're an artist, there's a lot of people who can graffiti. But if you're going to make it, you have to be able to, hey, I have 500 words, and you have to make that entire argument within those 500 words. You have 8 column inches because that's all the space you have for the newspaper today. We need to make this graphic design so it does X, X, and X. There's always parameters, conditions, right? If you're going to learn to play the piano, you can make some interesting noises, but you'll never be able to pull off, Rachmaninoff if you haven't done your scales, if you haven't practiced within a set series of parameters. It's true with sports. It's true with everything. And to say that we just let the kids go and be who they are, you're right. We're actually robbing them of a certain amount of freedom because they will never have the freedom to be excellent because they don't know the parameters against which to practice and better themselves.
Yeah. I mean, I see this all the time. I'm around families with little kids, and I see the difference between parents who have discipline versus parents who don't have discipline. And when I say on the second category, they don't have discipline, it's not even a malicious kind of a non-discipline. It's just almost the niceness, the kindness. Look, I just don't want to break their spirit.
Right.
And what I observe in those kids are just chaos. I mean, the home life is chaos. Everything they do is chaotic, and I'm sad for those parents and for those families.
There's a reason why we don't call forests or jungles as gardens, right? Gardens are maintained. You have to take care of it. There's a difference why we call it wild. Jungles are wild, whereas gardens are, it has a structure to it. It has parameters, as you said, and has a purpose behind it. And I think we need to learn even from nature itself as to how it works out in terms of the whole idea of goodness, truth, and beauty, how that is promoted even in the lives, in the gardens of our children.
No, that's good. Now, to Rousseau's credit, and Truman points it out, that Rousseau is not a subjectivist. So we have to be careful to not lay that on him. Yeah. And he does believe in a higher power because that higher power has given us consciences, apparently. I think the main issue that we see here, sometimes it's easy to overlook, but a big issue is the fact that we are inherently evil. That's the thing. We're not inherently good, as Rousseau would claim. So when you start with a false premise, like you're saying, Lenny, then it leads to all sorts of challenges and issues. So, if we're inherently
a
bad,
pilot flying to Hawaii, if his coordinates start off 2 degrees different, you don't notice it at first. And he can fly it textbook through the entire process of takeoff to landing, but If he starts off with 2 degrees off,
he's not going to be anywhere
it's
near.
going to be nothing but ocean by the time you're done. And that's really a dangerous place to be.
Yeah, he won't have fuel to correct his course. Yeah, for sure. So yeah, I think that's an important thing between Truman. I like what he does. He compares the 2 confessions, because one is by Rousseau. He very originally titled it Confessions, his main work, and Augustine's Confessions.
Right.
But the main difference is Rousseau thinks that we start with a good human nature versus Augustine, who gets it from Paul, that we are born sinners.
Yeah, you are no more human than when you are expressing yourself. And what in Truman shows that this is, we talk about the LGBTQ plus movement.
Mm-hmm.
That's where this whole idea really finds its germination. But interestingly, so Rousseau's story of the asparagus, of course, is the parallel of the very famous story of Aquinas and the pears. When he was a young lad, he and his friends saw some pears in somebody's garden, decided to steal them, not because they were hungry, not even because they needed pears. I mean, he had more pears that were actually of better variety in his own home, but the thrill of stealing was what compelled him. And he realized, reflecting back on it, he goes, that's what evil is. It was something inside of me that just got excited by doing what was dangerous, what was bad, what was forbidden.
While there's that inner voice and inner, just kind of like morality, that standard by which we actually judge our own conscience. At the same time, I think with regards to what Rousseau is saying, we need to be careful as well that we are not understanding the voice of our psychological self as the voice of God.
Yes, that's a big mistake.
And that's a big mistake happening within the church as well, that we give greater regard for our own voice, or even interpret that as God's voice.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, let's go with that. I know, Lenny, you pointed that out. So we have consciences, but again, if it's not grounded in God, we're in big trouble.
Right.
Because
then
it's...
You see, I mean, okay, so the whole concept of Christian nationalism, our patriotism kind of feels like it's what it's supposed to do. And there's nothing wrong with being patriotic. Matter of fact, we're to pray for our kings, right? Romans 13 talks about supporting the state and that God gives them the sword for a purpose. All of that's fine. But when it supersedes worship of God, as any man-made institution at some point will, because we're corrupt, when that happens, we have to say, no, we're doing it wrong.
Yeah.
If your church service is inviting politicians to discuss political issues on Sunday mornings and not the gospel, that may be a red flag.
Yeah. In politics, how do you guys see Rousseau affecting our current political landscape right now? So lots of talk about socialism right now. It's not uncommon. Do you think that there is a little bit of Rousseau in socialism and capitalism?
Well, there's definitely the assumption that nobody's challenging the idea that feelings aren't the basis, or that one's individual makeup isn't based on one's feelings. I don't. In politics, that's like the third rail. So any politician that runs tries to capitulate to wherever you're already at. They don't necessarily say, no, this is where you need to be. So I see that as the danger that can lead into those kinds of ideas.
In all this, I think we need to recognize that we have to bring back the reverence for the law of God.
Yeah.
I think that's the key that is missing in all this. As Christians, the danger is not just with people who don't believe in God, or who do not recognize Scripture as the Word of God. The danger is also with Christians who may live a life like a secularist, who may live a life just for the sake of being known a Christian, but not living the life of a Christian. What we need in our culture today is the standard of the Word of God, and we have to bring back our reverence to the revelation of God, and also reason as a source of truth, bringing both together to inform the life that we wish to live and build a society that is flourishing.
Right. Basically, you're talking about those things should be grounding our beliefs and our behavior.
Yes.
And not just a purely societal, anthropological
Yeah.
way of thinking. Yep, that's true. So you've been listening to apologetics.com radio, where we challenge believers to think and thinkers to believe. Our hope is that you've learned some aspect about the Christian worldview that strengthens your faith and make you want to learn more. So special thanks to my panel, Jacob and Lenny, and to our behind-the-scenes sound engineer back there, makes everything work for us. Thank you to our listeners. Until next time, good night.
Thank you for watching this Come Reason video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to see more videos like these, consider subscribing to our Come Reason YouTube channel by clicking on the subscribe button. And you can follow us on social media. Lastly, if you'd like to help keep these kinds of videos free, consider providing a donation by clicking on the donation button beside me. Thank you.